The sound of Clara Cassidy's voice carried across the wind, swept cemetery, like a prayer made tangible, reaching places no living soul had bothered to visit in years. She stood among the unmarked graves on the outskirts of Gold Hill, Nevada, her dark hair pinned beneath a simple bonnet, her worn Bible clutched in hands that trembled slightly as she sang Amazing Grace in a voice so pure it made the desert morning feel holy. Lucas Crawford sat astride his bay mare on the ridge above, watching her like he had every Sunday for the past 3 months. His hands rested on the pommel of his saddle, calloused fingers curled into themselves, as if trying to hold on to something that kept slipping away. He had stumbled upon her singing by accident that first time, riding back from a cattle drive that had taken him through the worst kind of hell. 23 days pushing ornery longhorns through dust storms and flash floods, losing 2 good men to a stampede near the Colorado border. When he had heard her voice drifting up from that forgotten cemetery, something in his chest had cracked open like a dry riverbed receiving rain after years of drought. She finished her hymn and knelt beside one of the sunken plots, laying down a handful of wildflowers she must have gathered on her walk from town. Lucas knew these graves held the forgotten ones, drifters who had died alone, prostitutes from the saloons who warranted no Christian burial in the eyes of the so-called decent folk, miners who had succumbed to lung fever with no family to claim them, Chinese laborers whose names nobody had bothered to record. Clara sang for them all without distinction, and that was what kept bringing Lucas back week after week. He dismounted quietly, leading his horse down the slope. The leather of his boots made soft sounds against the rocky soil. Clara looked up as he approached, her eyes the color of summer sky meeting his. She did not seem surprised to see him, though this was the first time he had descended from his watching post. "I did not mean to intrude," Lucas said, removing his hat. His dark hair fell across his forehead and he pushed it back with one hand. "I have been listening to your singing. It is beautiful." Clara stood, brushing dust from her simple gray dress. She was younger than he had thought from a distance, perhaps 21 or 22 to his 25 years. "You are not intruding. This place belongs to everyone, though most prefer to forget it exists." "Why do you come here?" Lucas asked, though he sensed he already knew part of the answer. "Because someone should remember them," Clara said simply. She gestured to the graves surrounding them, at least 30 mounds in various states of settling into the earth. They were people. They had hopes and fears and moments of joy. They deserved to be mourned. Lucas felt something tighten in his throat. "I lost my brother 2 years ago," he heard himself say, words that had been locked inside him rising to the surface unbidden. "Thomas. He was 17. A horse threw him during a roundup, broke his neck. One minute he was laughing, making jokes about the cook's terrible coffee. The next he was gone. We buried him proper, but I have not been able to visit his grave since the day we laid him down. I cannot seem to make myself go there." Clara's expression softened with understanding rather than pity, which made Lucas feel like he could breathe easier. "Grief is a strange companion," she said. "It makes demands we cannot always meet. Perhaps these souls here understand that better than most. They knew what it meant to be forgotten, to slip through the cracks of the world." "Is that why you sing to them?" "I sing because music was the only thing that kept me breathing after my mother died 3 years ago," Clara said, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. "She raised me alone after my father was killed in a mining accident when I was 8. When the cholera took her, I thought I might follow. But then I heard someone singing at her funeral, and I remembered that beauty could still exist even in the darkest moments. So I started coming here to these forgotten graves and I sang. For them, yes, but also for myself. To remember that life continues, that love continues, even after death. Lucas looked at her for a long moment, memorizing the determined set of her jaw, the way the morning light caught in her hair. "My name is Lucas Crawford. I work the Crawford Ranch east of town. My father and I run cattle, about 2,000 head." "Clara Cassidy," she replied, offering her hand. Her grip was firm, her palm warm against his. "I work at the general store during the week, help Mrs. Henderson with the accounts and inventory." They stood there in the cemetery, hands clasped longer than propriety suggested, and Lucas felt something shift inside him. It was like a door opening in a house that had been shuttered and dark for too long. "May I walk you back to town?" he asked. Clara smiled, and it transformed her entire face. "I would like that." They walked the 2 miles into Gold Hill with Lucas leading his horse, talking about everything and nothing. Clara told him about growing up in Sacramento, before her mother had moved them to Nevada in search of better opportunities. Lucas shared stories about the ranch, about his father's stubborn insistence on breeding horses alongside the cattle, about the way the desert bloomed after rare rains. The conversation flowed easily, naturally, like water finding its course. When they reached the edge of town, where neat wooden buildings lined streets still dusty from last night's wind, Lucas felt reluctance settle in his bones. He was not ready for this morning to end. "Will you be here next Sunday?" he asked. "I come every Sunday without fail," Clara said, "rain or shine. Then perhaps I might see you again, if you would not mind the company." "I would not mind at all, Mr. Crawford. Lucas, please." "Lucas," she repeated, and he liked the way his name sounded in her mouth. That week dragged by slower than any Lucas could remember. He went through the motions of ranch work with half his mind elsewhere. He and his father, Richard Crawford, were breaking a new string of 3-year-old geldings, preparing them for sale to the Army fort up near Virginia City. The work required focus and patience, qualities Lucas usually possessed in abundance, but he found himself distracted by memories of Clara's voice, the intelligent light in her eyes, the way she had spoken about grief and beauty as if they were 2 sides of the same coin. "You are going to get yourself kicked if you do not pay attention," Richard said on Thursday afternoon, as Lucas narrowly avoided a hoof to the ribs. His father was a weathered man of 52, with gray threading through his dark hair and lines carved deep around his eyes from years of squinting against the sun. "Where is your head today?" "Sorry," Lucas said, gentling the nervous gelding with practiced hands. "I will focus." Richard watched him with knowing eyes. "This have anything to do with why you have been heading out extra early on Sunday mornings lately?" Lucas felt heat creep up his neck. "I met someone. A woman. She sings at the old cemetery, the one out past the Chinese camp." "And," Richard prompted. "And I think I would like to see where this might lead, if she is willing." Richard's stern expression softened into something approaching approval. "Thomas would want you to move forward with your life, son. You know that." The mention of his brother sent the familiar ache through Lucas's chest, but for once it was not quite so sharp. "I know. I am starting to understand that." Sunday arrived with a cloudless sky, the kind of brilliant blue that made the whole world seem possible. Lucas rode out to the cemetery earlier than usual, his heart beating faster than the situation warranted. He had shaved carefully that morning, put on his best shirt under his leather vest. He felt foolish and hopeful in equal measure. Clara was already there, kneeling beside a grave in the far corner. Lucas dismounted and approached quietly, not wanting to disturb her. She was singing Rock of Ages in a voice that seemed to pierce straight through him, finding all the broken places and offering them light. When she finished, she turned to find him standing a respectful distance away. "Good morning, Lucas. Good morning," He moved closer, hat in hand. "I brought something if you will allow me." He pulled a small cloth bundle from his saddlebag and unwrapped it to reveal a collection of wildflowers, more varied and abundant than the small offerings Clara usually laid down. He had spent 2 hours yesterday evening riding through the foothills collecting them, choosing the brightest and most resilient blooms he could find. Clara's eyes widened, and her smile was luminous. "Lucas, these are wonderful. You did not have to do this." "I wanted to," he said simply. "You were right last week. These people deserve to be remembered. Seems only fitting they should have proper flowers." They spent the next hour moving from grave to grave together, Clara singing hymns while Lucas laid down flowers. She told him what little she knew about some of the occupants. This one had been a dance hall girl named Rosie who died of consumption in 1871. That one was a prospector called Old Jim who froze to death during a harsh winter. Here lay 2 Chinese men whose names nobody had recorded, killed in a cave-in at the Ophir mine in 1873. It was now late May of 1876, and Gold Hill was beginning to feel the effects of the declining silver production that plagued the entire Comstock Lode region. The great bonanza years were ending, and people were starting to drift away to new opportunities elsewhere. But Clara remained, and now Lucas understood why. She was the kind of person who stayed, who remembered, who bore witness to the forgotten. "Tell me about your mother," Lucas said as they finished their circuit of the cemetery, "if you are comfortable sharing." They sat on a flat boulder at the edge of the burial ground, looking out over the sagebrush-dotted valley below. Clara was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "Her name was Margaret," she began. "She was from Boston originally, from a good family. She fell in love with my father when he came through on his way west, and she gave up everything to follow him. Her family disowned her for marrying beneath her station, for choosing love over security. My father worked hard to give her a good life, but the mine took him when I was still young. After that, my mother did whatever work she could find: laundry, mending, cooking for the boarding houses. She made sure I learned to read and write and do figures. She wanted me to have choices she never had." "She sounds like a remarkable woman," Lucas said. "She was. When the cholera came through in 73, she was helping nurse the sick. She caught it and was gone within 3 days. I was 18, suddenly alone in the world. Mrs. Henderson at the general store took me in, gave me work and a room above the shop. She has been kind to me, but there is a loneliness that never quite goes away." Lucas understood that loneliness intimately. He reached out slowly, giving Clara time to pull away if she wished, and covered her hand with his. She turned her palm up and laced their fingers together. "I know something about loneliness," he said quietly. "After Thomas died, I felt like I was living underwater. Everything was muted and distant. My father tried to reach me, but I could not let him in. I blamed myself for not being there when it happened. I had been on the other side of the herd when Thomas got thrown. By the time I reached him, he was already gone. I kept thinking that if I had just been closer, faster, better, I could have done something." "But you could not have," Clara said gently, squeezing his hand. "Accidents happen in the space between heartbeats. You cannot hold yourself responsible for things beyond your control. My head knows that. My heart has been slower to accept it." "Hearts often are," Clara agreed, "but they can learn, given time and patience and the right reasons." They sat together in comfortable silence, hands joined, watching the sun climb higher in the sky. Lucas felt more at peace than he had in 2 years, and he knew it had everything to do with the woman beside him. Over the following weeks, a pattern established itself. Every Sunday, Lucas met Clara at the cemetery. They tended the unmarked graves together, she sang her hymns, and they talked about everything under the sun. He learned that she loved books, that Mrs. Henderson let her borrow volumes from the lending library that passed through town. She favored novels, particularly those by Charles Dickens and George Eliot. He told her about his dream of one day breeding horses that could survive the harsh desert conditions while maintaining the speed and spirit of thoroughbreds. On the third Sunday in June, Lucas brought a picnic lunch he had coaxed from their ranch cook, a taciturn Mexican man named Esteban, who had taken pity on Lucas's obvious infatuation. They spread a blanket beneath the sparse shade of a juniper tree and ate cold chicken, fresh bread, and peach preserves while the desert heat shimmered around them. "I look forward to Sundays now," Clara admitted, licking preserve from her thumb in a gesture so unconsciously charming that Lucas felt his breath catch. "The week feels like an endless waiting until I can see you again." "I feel the same," Lucas said, emboldened by her honesty. "Clara, I would like to call on you properly if you would permit it. Perhaps take you to dinner at the hotel on Saturday evening." Her smile was answer enough, but she said, "I would like that very much." Their first official courtship began on the last Saturday of June. Lucas cleaned up until he hardly recognized himself, his father teasing him mercilessly about the amount of time he spent trying to tame his hair. He borrowed the ranch wagon and drove into town just as the sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains. Clara met him outside Mrs. Henderson's store wearing a dress of pale blue that brought out her eyes. She had done something different with her hair, pinning it up in a style that revealed the elegant line of her neck. Lucas helped her into the wagon, acutely aware of how small her waist felt under his hands. Dinner at the Gold Hill Hotel was a revelation. They sat at a corner table with a view of the street, eating roast beef and potatoes while oil lamps flickered to life around them as darkness fell. The conversation never lagged. Clara told him about a temperance lecture that had come through town, about Mrs. Henderson's ongoing feud with the new mayor over taxes, about a letter she had received from a cousin in San Francisco. Lucas shared ranch gossip, about the new foal his father's prize mare had delivered, about the persistent coyote that had been harassing their chicken coop, about plans to drive a portion of their herd to market in Virginia City, come autumn. As he walked her home afterward, their shoulders brushing in the warm night air, Lucas felt certainty settle in his bones. This was the woman he wanted to build a life with. "May I kiss you?" he asked when they reached the door of her residence. Clara's answer was to rise on her toes and press her lips to his. The kiss was soft and sweet and full of promise, and when they broke apart, Lucas felt like he was glowing from the inside out. "Good night, Lucas," Clara whispered. "Good night," he managed, his voice rough with emotion. July brought scorching heat that baked the earth hard as stone. The ranch work intensified as they prepared for the autumn cattle drive. Lucas rose before dawn and often did not return until after dark, but he made time to see Clara whenever possible. On Sundays, they continued their ritual at the cemetery, though they now arrived together, Lucas picking her up from town in the wagon. One particularly hot Sunday in mid-July, they discovered a fresh grave among the unmarked ones. Someone had been buried recently, the earth still raw and loose over the plot. There was no marker, no indication of who lay beneath. Clara stood looking down at the grave, her expression troubled. "I wonder who this was." Lucas made inquiries in town the following week and learned that it was a young woman, barely 20, who had died in childbirth at one of the sporting houses on the edge of town. The baby had died too. Neither had any family to claim them, and the other women at the house had scraped together enough for a basic burial but nothing more. When Lucas told Clara, her eyes filled with tears. "That poor girl. She deserves better than to be forgotten." The next Sunday, Clara brought 2 bouquets of flowers instead of one. She laid them on the fresh grave and sang a lullaby, something soft and tender that spoke of a mother's love. Lucas watched her, his heart swelling with admiration for this woman who had so much compassion for strangers. "I want to do more," Clara said suddenly, looking up at Lucas with fierce determination. "These people should not be forgotten. I want to find out who they were, record their names, give them some measure of dignity." "That is a wonderful idea," Lucas said. "I will help however I can." They began their project that very week. Clara started asking questions around town, seeking out the old-timers who might remember the forgotten dead. Lucas helped her visit the Chinese camp, where an elderly man named Li Wai recalled the names of the workers buried in the unmarked cemetery. At the sporting houses, the madams were initially suspicious, but Clara's genuine compassion won them over. They shared stories of the women who had died over the years, helping Clara piece together names and dates. It was slow work, requiring patience and sensitivity. Many people were reluctant to talk about the dead who existed on society's margins. But Clara was persistent without being pushy, compassionate without being condescending. Gradually, she began to compile a list. By mid-August, she had identified nearly half of the unmarked graves. She bought a journal with money carefully saved from her wages and began recording everything she learned. Name, date of death if known, any details about their lives that people could remember. Lucas found himself falling deeper in love with her with each passing day. Her kindness, her determination, her unwavering belief that every person mattered, these qualities drew him like a moth to flame. But more than that, he loved the way she laughed at his terrible jokes, the way she listened when he talked about his dreams for the ranch, the way she had gently encouraged him to visit Thomas's grave. That last had been perhaps the greatest gift she had given him. One Sunday in late August, instead of going to the unmarked cemetery, Clara had asked Lucas to take her to the town cemetery where his brother was buried. He had resisted at first, the old fear rising up, but she had taken his hand and said, "I will be with you. You do not have to face it alone." They had stood together before Thomas's headstone, and Lucas had finally let himself cry. Clara had held him while he wept for his little brother, for all the things Thomas would never get to experience, for the guilt Lucas had carried like stones in his pockets. When the tears finally stopped, Lucas felt lighter than he had in years. "Thank you," he had whispered against Clara's hair. "You do not need to thank me for being here," she had replied. "This is what people who love each other do. Love." The word hung between them, acknowledged for the first time. "I do love you," Lucas said, pulling back to look into her eyes. "I love you so much it frightens me sometimes." "I love you too," Clara said simply. "I think I have from the first Sunday you came down from that ridge." They had kissed there in the cemetery, sealing their declarations with touch and breath, and the promise of a shared future. September arrived with slightly cooler temperatures, and the knowledge that Lucas would soon be leaving for the cattle drive to Virginia City. The plan was to take 500 head north, a journey that would require 3 weeks or more. Lucas hated the thought of being away from Clara for so long, but the ranch needed the income the sale would bring. "I will write to you every chance I get," he promised the night before he was set to leave. They sat on the porch behind the general store, Clara nestled against his side. "We will be passing through several towns with post offices, and I will write back," Clara assured him. "Just promise me you will be careful. I cannot bear the thought of anything happening to you." "I promise," Lucas said, tilting her chin up so he could kiss her properly. "And when I return, I want to speak with Mrs. Henderson about courting you officially, with the intention of marriage." "If that is something you would want." Clara's smile was radiant even in the darkness. That is very much something I would want. The cattle drive began on a cool Monday morning, with Lucas, his father, and 4 ranch hands pushing the herd north through the sage-covered hills. The work was grueling, requiring constant vigilance to keep the cattle moving and prevent them from scattering. They made about 12 miles a day, stopping at night wherever they could find water and decent grazing. Lucas thought about Clara constantly. In the quiet moments after supper, when the other men were playing cards or telling stories, he would pull out the small photograph she had given him before he left. It was a formal portrait taken by a traveling photographer the previous year, Clara sitting stiffly in her best dress. But if he looked closely, he could see the hint of the smile he loved in the corners of her mouth. 2 weeks into the drive, they stopped in a small mining town called Silver Springs. Lucas posted the 3 letters he had written to Clara and was delighted to find 2 from her waiting for him at the general delivery window. He read them that night by firelight, her words painting vivid pictures of daily life in Gold Hill. She had identified 2 more of the unmarked graves, she wrote. Mrs. Henderson had given her a raise. A traveling theater troupe had performed Romeo and Juliet in the town hall, though Clara admitted the leading man's performance left much to be desired. Lucas smiled at her descriptions, already composing his response in his head. He wrote by the flickering light of the campfire, telling her about the close call they had when a rattlesnake spooked part of the herd, about the incredible sunset they had witnessed over the mountains, about how he missed her more with each passing day. They reached Virginia City in early October, a sprawling mining town perched impossibly on the side of a mountain. The buyers at the stockyards drove a hard bargain, but Richard Crawford had been doing this for 30 years and refused to be lowballed. They finally settled on a fair price, and Lucas felt the satisfaction of a job well done. "We will head back tomorrow," Richard said that evening over dinner at a chop house. "Should be home in 10 days or so, quicker without the cattle slowing us down." Lucas could not wait. He bought a gift for Clara at one of Virginia City's surprisingly sophisticated shops, a delicate silver locket on a fine chain. Inside, he placed a tiny photograph of himself and a lock of his hair, feeling foolish and romantic all at once. The return journey passed in a blur of long days in the saddle and nights under the stars. When they finally rode back onto Crawford land on a crisp October afternoon, Lucas felt his heart lift at the sight of the familiar buildings, the corrals, the house his grandfather had built 40 years ago. He barely took time to wash the trail dust off before saddling a fresh horse and riding into Gold Hill. He found Clara closing up the general store for the evening, and the joy on her face when she saw him was worth every difficult mile of the journey. "You are back," she said unnecessarily, running into his arms with complete disregard for propriety. Lucas lifted her off her feet, spinning her around before setting her down and kissing her thoroughly. "I am back, and I am never leaving for that long again." "I missed you terribly," Clara said against his lips. "I miss you more," Lucas countered. "Come to dinner tomorrow night at the ranch. I want you to spend time with my father properly, and I have something I want to ask you." Clara's eyes sparkled with understanding. "Tomorrow night, yes." Lucas arrived at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house the following evening driving the wagon, dressed in his finest clothes. He had rehearsed what he wanted to say a dozen times, but when Clara appeared in a dress of deep green that made her eyes look like summer meadows, every planned word fled his mind. The drive out to the ranch took 30 minutes, time Lucas used to tell Clara about the successful sale and the drive home. His palms were sweating despite the cool evening air, nerves making his usually steady hands shake slightly. Richard Crawford was waiting on the porch when they arrived, looking almost as nervous as Lucas felt. He had put on a clean shirt and even trimmed his beard for the occasion. Lucas had told his father his intentions, and Richard had given his blessing immediately, saying he could not imagine a better daughter-in-law. Dinner was a surprisingly pleasant affair. Esteban had outdone himself, preparing roasted chicken with herbs, fresh vegetables from their garden, and an apple pie that filled the house with the scent of cinnamon. Richard engaged Clara in conversation about her grave-marking project, listening with genuine interest as she described her research. "That is important work," Richard said. "Too often we forget that every person has value, regardless of their station in life. My own father was a nobody, a failed farmer from Missouri who came west with nothing but determination. He built this ranch from nothing, and I have tried to honor his memory by remembering where we came from." "Lucas told me about your father," Clara said warmly. "He must have been a remarkable man." "He was stubborn as a mule and twice as ornery," Richard said with a fond smile. "But he loved deeply and worked hard, and that is the best legacy a person can leave." After dinner, Lucas asked Clara to walk with him. They strolled through the ranch yard as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. Lucas led her to the corral where several horses nickered softly, hoping for treats. "These are beautiful animals," Clara said, reaching out to stroke the velvet nose of a gray mare. "That is Silverbell," Lucas said. "She is the granddaughter of the first horse my grandfather ever bred. This ranch has always been about building something that lasts, creating a legacy that endures beyond one person's lifetime." He took Clara's hands in his, feeling the rightness of this moment settle over him like a blessing. "Clara, I have been thinking about legacy a lot lately, about what I want my life to mean, about the mark I want to leave on this world. And I have realized that none of it matters if I do not have someone to share it with, someone who makes me want to be better than I am." Clara's eyes were bright with unshed tears, her hands trembling in his. "You have brought light back into my life," Lucas continued. "You have taught me that it is possible to honor grief while still choosing joy, to remember the dead while embracing the living. I love you more than I have words to express, and I want to spend the rest of my life trying to make you as happy as you make me." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, dropping to one knee in the dust of the corral. "Clara Cassidy, will you marry me?" "Yes," Clara said without hesitation, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Lucas stood and kissed her, tasting salt and joy, and slipped the ring onto her finger. It was his grandmother's ring, a simple gold band with a small diamond that caught the last rays of sunlight. Clara held her hand up, admiring it, then threw her arms around Lucas's neck. "I love you so much," she whispered. "I love you too," Lucas said. "Forever." They were married on the first Sunday in November in the small church in Gold Hill, with half the town in attendance. Clara wore a dress of ivory silk that Mrs. Henderson had helped her sew, and Lucas wore a new suit ordered from a tailor in Virginia City. Richard stood as Lucas's best man, and Mrs. Henderson stood with Clara. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. When the minister pronounced them man and wife, Lucas kissed his bride with such tenderness that several women in the congregation openly wept. Afterward, there was a celebration at the town hall, with music and dancing and food contributed by their friends and neighbors. But before the festivities began, Lucas and Clara made one stop. They drove out to the unmarked cemetery, still in their wedding clothes, and stood among the forgotten graves. Clara sang Amazing Grace one more time, her voice strong and sure, and Lucas stood beside her, his hand in hers, and added his rough baritone to her melody. They were starting their life together, but they would not forget those who had gone before. The forgotten would be remembered, the unmarked graves would receive their due, and love would continue its work of healing and transformation. Clara moved into the ranch house, and Lucas discovered the profound joy of daily intimacy with the person he loved most in the world. He woke each morning to find her beside him, her dark hair spread across the pillow, her breathing soft and steady. They shared breakfast with Richard, who welcomed Clara into the family with genuine warmth. During the day, while Lucas worked the ranch, Clara continued her research on the unmarked graves, riding into town several times a week to pursue leads and record information. In the evenings, they would sit together on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains, talking about everything and nothing. Lucas told her stories about his childhood, about Thomas's mischievous nature, about the time they had accidentally let all the chickens out and spent hours trying to recapture them. Clara shared memories of her mother, of learning to read by candlelight, of the day she realized she wanted to use her life to make a difference in the world. On Sundays, they continued to visit the unmarked cemetery together. Clara sang her hymns while Lucas tended the graves, pulling weeds and making sure each plot was marked with stones or flowers. Gradually, as Clara's research bore fruit, they began adding simple wooden markers with names and dates. The forgotten were being remembered, given back their identities and their dignity. Winter came to Nevada with cold winds and occasional snow. The ranch work shifted to indoor tasks, repairing equipment and preparing for spring. Lucas spent more time in the barn, working with the horses, beginning to implement his dream of selective breeding. Clara often joined him, learning to understand the animals, appreciating the patience and skill required to train them properly. On Christmas Eve, Clara gave Lucas a gift that took his breath away. It was a leather-bound book, hand-stitched, containing the complete record of her research on the unmarked graves. Inside were the names she had discovered, the stories she had collected, sketches of where each grave was located. On the first page, she had written a dedication, "To Lucas, who taught me that love gives us the courage to face the past and embrace the future. With all my heart, Clara." "This is incredible," Lucas said, turning the pages carefully. "You have done something remarkable here. These people live again because of your dedication." "Our dedication," Clara corrected. "I could not have done this without your support." Lucas's gift to Clara was the silver locket he had bought in Virginia City, which she had been wearing constantly since he gave it to her on their wedding night. But he had added something new. Inside the locket, alongside his photograph and lock of hair, he had placed a tiny painted miniature of the unmarked cemetery, done by a traveling artist he had commissioned. It was a reminder of where their love had begun, of the foundation on which they were building their life together. Spring of 1877 brought new life to the ranch. Several mares foaled, including Silverbell, who produced a strong colt with her gray coloring and a white star on his forehead. Lucas was delighted, seeing in the colt the potential he had been breeding for, strength and endurance combined with intelligence and spirit. In March, Clara realized she was pregnant. She told Lucas on a Sunday morning at the unmarked cemetery, after she had finished singing. They were alone among the graves, the desert spreading out around them in shades of brown and green. "I have news," Clara said, taking Lucas's hands in hers. "We are going to have a baby." Lucas felt the world tilt and resettle into a new configuration. He was going to be a father. The joy that flooded through him was so intense it almost hurt. "Are you certain?" he asked. "As certain as I can be. Mrs. Henderson helped me recognize the signs. The baby should come in October." Lucas pulled Clara into his arms, holding her gently, reverently, amazed by the miracle growing inside her. "I love you," he said. "Thank you for this gift. We made this gift together," Clara said, smiling up at him. "And I believe we will make wonderful parents." The pregnancy agreed with Clara. She bloomed with health, her skin glowing, her eyes bright. She continued her work at the Unmarked cemetery for as long as she was able, though Lucas insisted she avoid any strenuous activity. By summer, her condition was obvious, and the women of Gold Hill rallied around her, offering advice and assistance. Mrs. Henderson threw a party for Clara in August, inviting every woman in town. They brought gifts, tiny clothes and blankets and toys, and shared stories of their own experiences with childbirth. Clara accepted it all with grace and gratitude, touched by the outpouring of support. Lucas fretted constantly, worried about everything that could go wrong. His own mother had died bringing him into the world, a fact that haunted him as Clara's due date approached. Richard, understanding his son's fear, sat him down one evening in September. "You cannot control everything," Richard said. "Life is risk, love is risk, but it is a risk worth taking. Clara is strong and healthy, and we have arranged for the best midwife in the county to attend her. You must have faith." "I am trying," Lucas admitted, "but I cannot help remembering that I never knew my mother and Thomas died so young. What if something goes wrong?" "What if everything goes right?" Richard countered. "You cannot live your life in fear of loss. That is not living at all." Lucas took his father's words to heart. He focused on preparing for the baby's arrival, converting a small bedroom next to the one he shared with Clara into a nursery. He built a cradle from oak, sanding it until the wood was smooth as silk. Clara sewed curtains and linens, singing softly as she worked. Their son was born on October 15, 1877, after a labor that lasted 12 hours. Lucas paced outside the bedroom like a caged animal while the midwife and Mrs. Henderson attended Clara. When he finally heard the thin, reedy cry of a newborn, he nearly collapsed with relief. The midwife opened the door, smiling. "You have a healthy boy, Mr. Crawford. And your wife did wonderfully. You can come in now." Lucas entered the room on shaking legs. Clara lay in their bed, looking exhausted but radiant, cradling a tiny bundle against her chest. He approached slowly, reverently, and looked down at his son for the first time. The baby had a shock of dark hair and a red, wrinkled face. His eyes were closed, but his tiny fists waved in the air as if testing this new world he had entered. Lucas felt something crack open in his chest, a flood of love so powerful it brought tears to his eyes. "He is perfect," Lucas whispered. "He is ours," Clara said, smiling up at him. "What should we call him?" They had discussed names extensively during the pregnancy but had not settled on anything definite. Lucas looked at his son, then at his wife, then back at the child. "Thomas," he said quietly, "if you agree, I want to honor my brother to keep his name alive." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Thomas Crawford, it is perfect." Lucas sat on the edge of the bed, putting his arm around Clara and gazing down at their son. This tiny person was the culmination of everything they had built together, proof that life continued, that love created new possibilities even in the shadow of loss. Richard came in a few minutes later, his weathered face softening when he saw his grandson. "He is a fine-looking boy," he said gruffly. "Welcome to the world, Thomas Crawford." The first weeks of Thomas's life were a blur of sleepless nights and steep learning curves. Lucas discovered that fatherhood was both harder and more rewarding than anything he had ever attempted. He learned to change diapers and soothe the baby's cries, to walk the floor at 3 in the morning singing off-key lullabies. Clara navigated the challenges of nursing and recovering from childbirth with the same determination she brought to everything else. They were exhausted and overwhelmed and happier than they had ever been. On the first Sunday after Clara felt strong enough to leave the house, they bundled Thomas in blankets and drove out to the unmarked cemetery. It had been 2 months since Clara had last visited, and she had missed it terribly. The November morning was cold but clear, the sky a brilliant blue. Clara stood among the graves with Thomas in her arms and sang Blessed Assurance, her voice as pure and strong as ever. Lucas stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, and felt the circle of their life complete itself. They had begun here, in this forgotten place, 2 broken people seeking peace among the dead. Now they stood here whole, with a child who represented the future, still honoring the past but no longer trapped by it. "I have been thinking," Clara said when she finished singing, "about what we should do with my research, all the names and stories I have collected. What do you have in mind?" Lucas asked. "I want to publish it," Clara said. "Make a permanent record that will outlast us. These people should not be forgotten, and I want to ensure their stories survive." "That is a wonderful idea," Lucas said. "How can I help?" Over the following months, Clara worked on preparing her research for publication. She organized her notes, wrote introductions for each section, and sought out additional information to fill gaps in the narrative. Lucas helped by hiring a clerk in Virginia City to type up her handwritten pages and by covering the costs of printing. By spring of 1878, they had produced a slim volume titled Remembered, The Forgotten Dead of Gold Hill. It was not a commercial publication, but rather something they had printed privately to distribute throughout the community. Clara gave copies to the library, to the churches, to anyone who expressed interest. The response was overwhelming. People who had lost loved ones to the margins of society came forward to thank Clara for her work. The Chinese community held a special ceremony honoring the workers she had identified, incorporating their names into the annual remembrance of ancestors. Even the madams at the sporting houses expressed appreciation for acknowledging the women who had died in their establishments. Clara's project had started as a personal quest to honor the forgotten, but it had become something larger, a community effort to ensure that no one disappeared without trace. Thomas grew from an infant into a curious toddler, learning to walk and talk and explore his world with fearless enthusiasm. He had his mother's eyes and his father's stubborn jaw, and he was the light of Lucas's life. Lucas taught him to love horses and the land, to appreciate the harsh beauty of the Nevada desert. Clara taught him kindness and compassion, reading to him every night, singing him the same hymns she sang at the cemetery. On Thomas's 2nd birthday in October of 1879, Clara told Lucas she was pregnant again. Their daughter, whom they named Margaret after Clara's mother, was born in June of 1880, a tiny, fierce thing with a temper that made them all laugh. Lucas adored her instantly, this miniature version of his wife who seemed determined to take on the world from her first breath. Life settled into a rhythm of work and family, of Sunday visits to the unmarked cemetery, of watching their children grow. The ranch prospered under Lucas and Richard's careful management. The horse breeding program Lucas had started was showing results, producing animals that commanded premium prices. In 1882, Richard's health began to fail. At 58, he was still relatively young, but decades of hard labor had taken their toll. He developed a persistent cough that the doctor diagnosed as lung fever, likely contracted from years of breathing desert dust. Richard faced his illness with the same stoic determination he had brought to everything else in his life. He spent his final months teaching Lucas everything he knew about running the ranch, passing on wisdom accumulated over 3 decades. He spent time with his grandchildren, bouncing Margaret on his knee and teaching Thomas to rope fence posts. He died on a cold January morning in 1883, Clara holding one of his hands while Lucas held the other. His last words were, "Take care of them, son. You have built something good here. Keep building." They buried Richard in the town cemetery next to Lucas's mother and brother, and Clara sang at his funeral with such beauty that grown men wept openly. Lucas grieved his father deeply, but found comfort in knowing that Richard had died surrounded by love, confident in the legacy he was leaving behind. The Unmarked Cemetery project had expanded over the years. What had begun as Clara's solitary effort had grown into a community initiative. A committee had formed, dedicated to maintaining the graves and continuing the research Clara had started. They had raised money to install proper headstones for all the identified graves, simple markers of local stone carved with names and dates. On the 10th anniversary of the day, Lucas had first descended from the ridge to speak with Clara. They stood together at the cemetery with their children. Thomas was nearly 13 now, gangly and earnest, already showing signs of the man he would become. Margaret was 9, bright and curious, full of questions about everything. "Why do we come here every Sunday?" Margaret asked, not for the first time. Clara knelt beside her daughter, taking her small hands. "Because every person matters, sweetheart. These people did not have anyone to remember them when they died, so we remember them now. We make sure they are not forgotten." "Will someone remember us when we die?" Margaret asked with a child's directness. "Yes," Lucas said, ruffling his daughter's hair. "You will be remembered because of the life you live, the people you love, the kindness you show. That is what creates a legacy that endures." Thomas had wandered over to Thomas Crawford's grave, the one marking Lucas's brother. Lucas watched his son trace the carved letters with his fingers, reading the dates. "I was named after him," Thomas said. It was a statement, not a question. "You were," Lucas confirmed. "He died young before he had the chance to do all the things he dreamed of. But by carrying his name, you keep him alive in a way." "I will try to make it a good name," Thomas said solemnly. Lucas felt his throat tighten with emotion. "You already have, son." Clara began to sing, and Lucas added his voice to hers. Their children joined in, the four of them creating a harmony that rose into the clear desert air. Around them, the graves stood silent witness to the enduring power of remembrance and love. The years continued to unfold. Thomas grew into a fine young man, passionate about horses like his father, but with a gift for gentling even the most difficult animals. Margaret developed her mother's compassion and her father's business sense, keeping meticulous records of the ranch operations and suggesting improvements that increased their efficiency. In 1890, when Thomas was nearly 21, he fell in love with the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a spirited young woman named Sarah who shared his love of horses. Lucas and Clara gave their blessing, delighted to see their son find the kind of partnership they had built together. Thomas and Sarah were married in the spring of 1891, and Lucas found himself thinking about the passage of time, about how quickly life moved from one generation to the next. His son was beginning his own family, starting the next chapter of the Crawford legacy. Margaret showed no interest in settling down, much to Clara's amusement and mild exasperation. She wanted to go to college, to study medicine or law, to make her mark on the world in ways that were just becoming possible for women. Lucas and Clara supported her ambitions, even as they worried about her facing a world that was not always kind to women with aspirations. The Unmarked Cemetery remained a constant in their lives. Every Sunday without fail, unless weather or illness prevented it, Lucas and Clara visited those forgotten graves. They had been doing it now for over 15 years, and it had become as much a part of their routine as breathing. Other things changed around them. Gold Hill continued its slow decline as the silver played out. Many families moved away, seeking opportunities elsewhere. But the Crawfords remained, deeply rooted in the land they had claimed as home. In 1895, on a particularly beautiful Sunday in May, Lucas and Clara stood at the cemetery alone. Their children were grown now, pursuing their own lives. Thomas and Sarah were expecting their first child, making Lucas and Clara grandparents in waiting. Margaret was away at college in California, studying to become a teacher. "You remember the first time you saw me here?" Clara asked, leaning against Lucas's side. "I remember everything about that day," Lucas said. "I remember thinking your voice was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. I remember being terrified to approach you, certain you would tell me to leave." "I remember seeing you on that ridge," Clara said. "Week after week, watching but never approaching. I wondered what kept bringing you back." "You kept bringing me back," Lucas said simply. "Your voice, yes, but more than that. Your compassion, your dedication to honoring these forgotten people. I was lost back then, drowning in grief I could not escape, and you threw me a lifeline without even knowing it." Clara turned to face him, cupping his weathered face in her hands. They were both older now, lines carved around their eyes, gray threading through their hair. But when Lucas looked at Clara, he still saw the young woman who had sung hymns over unmarked graves, the woman who had taught him that healing was possible. "I love you," Clara said. "After all these years, through everything we have weathered together, I love you more now than I did the day we married." "I love you too," Lucas said, kissing her softly. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me." They stood there in the cemetery, surrounded by the graves they had tended for nearly 2 decades, and Lucas felt the weight of gratitude settle over him like a benediction. His life had not been easy, had been marked by loss and hardship and struggle. But it had also been marked by love, by purpose, by the knowledge that he had made a difference in the world, however small. Their first grandchild, a boy named Richard after his great-grandfather, was born in August of 1895. Lucas held the tiny infant in his arms and marveled at the continuation of the family line, at the way love and life persisted in the face of everything. "He looks like Thomas did at this age," Clara said, watching her husband with their grandson. "Another generation," Lucas said wonderingly. "Another chance to get it right." As the 19th century drew to a close, Lucas and Clara found themselves reflecting more often on the journey they had traveled together. They had been married for nearly 25 years, had built a life and a family, had contributed to their community in ways large and small. The Unmarked Cemetery Project had inspired similar efforts in other towns throughout Nevada. Clara's book had been reprinted several times, circulated widely, and had become a model for others seeking to honor forgotten dead in their own communities. She received letters from people across the West, thanking her for showing them a different way to approach death and remembrance. Lucas's horse breeding program had become regionally famous, producing animals sought after for their intelligence, endurance, and temperament. The Crawford name meant something in ranching circles, a reputation for quality and integrity that Lucas worked hard to maintain. But more than these external achievements, Lucas and Clara had created something private and profound in their marriage. They had built a partnership based on mutual respect, genuine affection, and shared values. They had faced grief and loss together and had come through stronger. They had raised children who were good people, who carried forward the lessons about compassion and remembrance that their parents had taught them. In the spring of 1900, as a new century dawned, Lucas and Clara stood once more at the Unmarked Cemetery. They were in their late 40s now, not yet old but no longer young. The graves were immaculately maintained, each one marked with a proper headstone, each one tended with care by the committee that had formed around Clara's initial efforts. "I have been thinking about what comes next," Clara said as they walked among the graves. "We have done good work here, but I wonder if there is more we could do." "What did you have in mind?" Lucas asked. "I want to establish a fund," Clara said. "Something that will ensure these graves are maintained in perpetuity, long after we are gone. I want to make sure that future generations continue to remember, to honor these forgotten souls." "That is a beautiful idea," Lucas said. "We can set it up through the bank, establish a trust that will generate income for maintenance." They spent the next several months working with lawyers and bankers, establishing the Unmarked Graves Memorial Fund. They seeded it with a substantial sum from their savings and arranged for a portion of the ranch's annual profits to be donated to it in perpetuity. Other community members contributed as well, touched by the idea of creating something that would last beyond their individual lifetimes. The fund was formalized in a ceremony at the cemetery on the first Sunday of October 1900, exactly 24 years after Lucas and Clara had first met. The entire community turned out, standing among the graves they had all helped to preserve. Clara sang Amazing Grace one more time, her voice still pure and strong, and Lucas stood beside her, his hand in hers, grateful beyond measure for the life they had built together. Their son Thomas spoke at the ceremony, representing the next generation. "My parents taught me that every life has value," he said. "That no one should be forgotten, that remembrance is a sacred duty. This fund ensures that their work, and the work of all of you who have contributed, will continue long after we are gone. It is a testament to what a community can achieve when people care about something larger than themselves." Margaret, home from her teaching position in Sacramento, added her own words. "I grew up coming to this cemetery every Sunday," she said. "At the time, I did not fully understand why it mattered so much. But now, as an adult, I see the profound wisdom in what my parents were doing. They were teaching us empathy, compassion, and the importance of bearing witness to the lives of others. These lessons have shaped who I am, and I will carry them forward in my own work." As the ceremony concluded and people began to disperse, Lucas and Clara remained behind. They walked slowly through the cemetery, pausing at each grave, remembering the stories they had uncovered, the lives they had helped to preserve in memory. "We did something good here," Clara said quietly. "We did," Lucas agreed. "Together." The years that followed brought the ordinary joys and sorrows of life. Thomas and Sarah had 3 more children, filling the ranch house with noise and laughter. Margaret married a fellow teacher and settled in San Francisco, though she visited as often as her schedule allowed. Richard, their first grandson, showed signs of inheriting his grandfather's way with horses and his great-grandmother's scholarly inclinations. Lucas and Clara grew older gracefully, their love deepening with each passing year. They still visited the Unmarked cemetery every Sunday, though the walks were slower now, the standing for long periods more difficult. But they never missed a week unless absolutely necessary. It had become their ritual, their way of honoring the foundation on which their life together had been built. In 1908, on a warm June morning, they celebrated their 33rd wedding anniversary. Their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a party that lasted from noon until long after dark. There was music and dancing, food and laughter, stories told and retold until they became family legend. As the party wound down and the younger grandchildren were carried off to bed, Lucas and Clara sat together on the porch swing, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The sounds of their family filled the house behind them, a comforting backdrop to the quiet of the evening. "Thank you," Lucas said, taking Clara's hand. "For what?" Clara asked, though her smile suggested she knew. "For everything. For loving me, for building this life with me, for teaching me that healing is possible, for being my partner in every sense of the word." "You gave me just as much," Clara said. "You saw me when I felt invisible. You valued the work I was doing when others dismissed it. You supported my dreams and helped me achieve them. We have been partners, equals, building something together that neither of us could have created alone." They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, hearts full. The desert night wrapped around them, the same desert that had witnessed their first meeting, their courtship, their wedding, the births of their children and grandchildren. The land endured, and so did love. In 1910, Clara's health began to decline. She developed a heart condition that left her weak and short of breath. The doctor said there was nothing to be done except rest and avoid exertion. Clara chafed against the restrictions, hating the way illness limited her ability to do the things she loved. But she still insisted on visiting the Unmarked cemetery every Sunday. Lucas would drive her in the wagon, help her down, and support her as she walked slowly among the graves. Her voice was not as strong as it once had been, but she still sang her hymns, and to Lucas, they were still the most beautiful sound in the world. On a Sunday in early November, Clara asked Lucas to take her to Thomas's grave, the one marking his brother. They stood together before the headstone, and Clara leaned heavily on Lucas's arm. "I have been thinking about what comes after," she said quietly. "When my time comes, I want to be buried here in the town cemetery near your family. But I want you to know that what we did at the Unmarked cemetery, that mattered. That was important work, and I am proud of what we accomplished." "Clara, do not talk like that," Lucas said, though fear clutched at his heart. "You have years left." "Perhaps," Clara said. "But we should talk about these things while we can. I want you to promise me something." "Anything," Lucas said. "Promise me that you will keep living, really living, after I am gone. Do not shut yourself away in grief the way you did after Thomas died. You have so much to offer the world, to our family. Promise me you will stay present and engaged." "I promise," Lucas said, though the words felt like broken glass in his throat. "But you are not going anywhere for a long time yet." Clara smiled, and for a moment, Lucas saw the young woman she had been, vibrant and determined and full of fire. "I love you, Lucas Crawford. Loving you has been the greatest privilege of my life." "I love you too," Lucas said, holding her carefully as if she might break. "More than words can say." Clara rallied somewhat over the winter, her condition stabilizing. She was able to enjoy Christmas with the family, to hold her newest great-grandchild, to continue the rhythms of daily life. But Lucas could see the toll the illness was taking, the way she tired more easily, the way pain sometimes shadowed her eyes. Spring came late in 1911, winter clinging stubbornly to the land. On the first warm Sunday in April, Clara insisted on visiting the Unmarked cemetery one more time. Lucas helped her from the wagon, and they walked slowly among the graves, Clara leaning heavily on his arm. She sang Amazing Grace, her voice thin but sweet, and Lucas added his harmony, their voices blending as they had for over 30 years. When the hymn ended, Clara looked up at Lucas with tears in her eyes. "Thank you for sharing this with me," she said. "For all these years, for understanding why it mattered." "It mattered because you mattered," Lucas said. "Because your compassion and your dedication inspired everyone around you. You changed this community, Clara. You changed me." They stood there for a long moment, surrounded by the graves they had tended together, the forgotten souls they had helped to remember. And Lucas sent up a prayer, not for the dead, but for the living, for more time with the woman who had saved him, who had taught him to live again. Clara passed away on a quiet morning in May 1911, surrounded by her family. She went peacefully, slipping away in her sleep with Lucas holding her hand. The funeral was the largest Gold Hill had seen in years, people coming from all over Nevada to pay their respects to the woman who had dedicated herself to honoring the forgotten. They buried her in the town cemetery, and Lucas stood dry-eyed through the service, shock and grief holding tears at bay. It was only later, when everyone had gone and he stood alone before her grave, that he finally broke down, weeping for the loss of his partner, his love, his Clara. He kept his promise to her, though. He did not shut himself away in grief. He remained engaged with the ranch, with his family, with life. But every Sunday, without fail, he visited both cemeteries. First, he went to Clara's grave in the town cemetery, telling her about the week, about their children and grandchildren, about the small details of daily life. Then he drove out to the Unmarked cemetery and sang the hymns she had loved, his voice rough and uncertain but carrying forward her legacy. Years passed. Lucas grew old, his hair white, his body stooped, but his mind remained sharp and his heart remained full of love for the woman he had lost and the life they had shared. He told stories to his grandchildren and great-grandchildren about Clara, about her dedication to the forgotten, about the importance of compassion and remembrance. In the spring of 1920, Lucas realized he was dying. His heart was failing, the doctor said, worn out after 70 years of beating. Lucas accepted this with equanimity. He had lived a long, full life, had loved deeply and been loved in return. He was ready to rest. On his final Sunday, Thomas drove him out to the Unmarked cemetery one last time. Lucas moved slowly among the graves, touching the headstones, remembering the stories behind each name. He stood at the spot where he had first spoken to Clara, where their love story had begun, and he sang Amazing Grace one final time, thinking of her voice joining his from wherever she waited. Lucas Crawford died 3 days later, peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by the family he and Clara had created together. They buried him next to her in the town cemetery, and the entire community turned out to honor the man who, together with his wife, had taught them about the power of remembrance and love. On the headstone, beneath his name and dates, they carved a simple inscription. He found peace in love and gave it freely to others. The Unmarked cemetery continued to be maintained by the fund Lucas and Clara had established. Generations of Gold Hill residents grew up visiting those graves, learning the stories of the forgotten, understanding that every life matters. The legacy Lucas and Clara had built together endured, a testament to what two people could accomplish when they dedicated themselves to something larger than themselves. And every Sunday, somewhere in Gold Hill, someone would sing a hymn over those unmarked graves, carrying forward the tradition that Clara had started so many years ago, ensuring that the forgotten would never truly be forgotten, and that the love story that had begun in that cemetery would continue to inspire long after its participants had passed into memory themselves. The Crawford Ranch prospered under Thomas's careful management and eventually passed to his children and grandchildren. They never forgot the lessons their great-grandparents had taught them about compassion, about honoring the forgotten, about the importance of community and remembrance. Clara's book was reprinted multiple times over the decades, becoming a historical document of value, a window into a particular time and place, and a reminder of one woman's determination to ensure that no one disappeared without trace. Historians and genealogists used it to track down information about the forgotten dead, connecting them to families who had never known what became of their ancestors. The Unmarked cemetery itself became a historical landmark, protected and preserved for future generations. Visitors came from all over the country to see it, to learn about the woman who had dedicated herself to honoring the forgotten, and the man who had found his peace by loving her. And so the story of Lucas and Clara lived on, a testament to the enduring power of love, to the importance of remembrance, to the truth that every person matters, and to the possibility of healing even the deepest wounds when we open ourselves to compassion and connection. Their love had begun in a cemetery among the forgotten dead, but it had blossomed into something that touched countless lives, creating ripples that spread far beyond anything they could have imagined when Lucas first descended from that ridge to speak to the woman whose voice had pierced his grief and shown him the path back to life. In the decades that followed their deaths, Gold Hill itself changed dramatically. The mining that had sustained it dwindled to nothing, and the population dropped from thousands to just a handful of families. But the cemetery remained, both the town cemetery where Lucas and Clara lay together and the unmarked cemetery where their love story had begun. People still came to visit, drawn by the story of the couple who had dedicated themselves to honoring the forgotten. On certain Sundays, if you listened carefully, you could almost hear Clara's voice on the wind, singing her hymns over the graves, and you could imagine Lucas standing beside her, hand in hers, at peace at last. Their great-great-grandchildren still lived on the Crawford Ranch, which had been in the family for over 100 years by the time the 21st century arrived. They maintained the fund that Lucas and Clara had established, ensuring that the unmarked cemetery continued to receive the care and attention it deserved. The story came full circle every generation, as young Crawford descendants discovered for themselves the power of compassion, the importance of honoring those who came before, and the truth that love, when given freely and received with open hearts, has the power to transform not just individuals but entire communities.